Scriptures might have hold. Those things were written. They were written with a purpose in mind. They were written for our learning. They were written to provide us with comfort and to give us patience. And so we need to know this history. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we have the Apostle Paul again as he talks about history. And he talks about what we can gain from this history. Notice that we have in verse 6, "Now these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happen unto them for examples, that they are written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the world are come." And so these things were written for our admonition. They were written to teach us some things. We need to be well acquainted with the history of the Old Testament. If we are not acquainted with it, then we are doomed to repeat it. Now go to Psalm chapter 78, and you'll see that in this historical psalm, that it begins with that very warning. It begins with a warning in the opening verses of this psalm that this is history that your children need to know and your grandchildren need to know. And if you don't teach this history to your children, and they don't teach it to their children, then the mistakes of the past are going to be repeated. The things that happened to those that went before, they'll happen to you if you don't teach them this history. Now notice in Psalm 78 and verse 4, "We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and His strength and His wonderful works that He hath done." We're not going to hide these things. We're going to make sure that our children know these things. Now people today, generally speaking, whatever history you're talking about, do not know a great deal about history. But they know less about biblical history than they do of any other kind of history. And so this is history that we must make sure that our children know. It says in verse 5, "For He established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God." Notice these things need to be taught. They need to be taught so that they will set their hope in God. Now our children are going to put their hope in something. They may put their hope in government. They may put their hope in money. They may put their hope in something else. But they're going to put their hope in something. And the only way that they're going to put their hope in God is if we teach them about God. And we teach them the history of God's people. Then they'll put their hope where it needs to be rather than in something else. Because our hope isn't in money. Our hope isn't in government. We all are thankful for those that lead our country, and we do the best that we can to elect the right people to that office. But our hope isn't in government. Our hope is in God. Government will let us down. That's been proven time and time again. Our hope isn't in money, because the writer of Proverbs in Ecclesiastes, Solomon, clearly tells us that it has wings and it'll fly away. We can't put our hope there. We have to put our hope in the unchanging hands of Almighty God. And so we teach our children these things so they'll put their hope in the right place, so that they won't be like previous generations, but that they will be better than those generations that went before them. I think it has generally been the case in the last 100 years, maybe a little bit more than that in our country, that each generation has had the basic faith, belief, that the next generation would be better off than they were. I think that's just been something that we've kind of accepted as a nation. It's something our parents accepted, that life would be better for us than it was for them. And I'm not sure that we haven't reached a point in our history as a nation that we've ceased to believe that. I think we may be beginning to turn a corner to where we may at least begin to think that life won't be as good for our children as it was for us. And what a sad day that is, if that is the case. But getting away from just the physical aspect of that, let's think about the spiritual aspect of that. I hope that the best days of the church are not behind us. I hope that the best days of the church are yet ahead of us. I hope that the spiritual environment that my children will have will be a better spiritual environment even than what I had. But I have my fears. I have my fears that that'll be the case. I have my fears that sound congregations will continue to dwindle. Conservative congregations will be harder and harder to find. And our children will struggle to find congregations with whom they can work and worship without having major battles and major struggles virtually every time they come together. That's a concern. How do we keep that from being the case? How do we allow this congregation to be the exception to that, if that is what the future is? How do we help this congregation to be the one congregation where they can still come and still attend and still worship and not have those battles and struggles? How do we do that? Well, we do it in the same way that's being done in Psalm 78. We teach them history. We teach them the history of the church. We teach them of what has happened, the mistakes that have been made, that they might not make those same mistakes as they reach the point to where they are the ones making the decisions. Now, as we look at Psalm 78, we're going to see in this psalm what God does and what their fathers did. What their heavenly Father did and what their earthly fathers did. And that's going to be contrasted. And so we want to take a look at that. I think it'll be simple to you as we move through it. First of all, we find that God spake to them. God spake to them, but they spake against Him. Notice that God spake to them. Notice in verse 5, "For He established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children." God spake to His people. God gave His people a testimony. God gave His people a law. God gave them this instruction from heaven. God guided Moses to write these words. Gave them a law. God spake to them. But this context will tell us that they spake against God. Very opposite of what God did. Notice that beginning in verse 19, "Yea, they spake against God. They said, Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Behold, He smote the rock, that the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed. Can He give bread also? Can He provide flesh for His people? Therefore the Lord heard this and was wroth. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel." Now here, God has provided them with water. But they say, "Can He provide us with bread also?" They speak against God. God has done nothing but good for them. God has done nothing but meet their needs from the time they left Egypt. And yet, they speak out against God, when all that God has done for them is to speak to them and to give them His law and to give them His commandments and to bless them. But they speak against Him. Notice that God led them, but they left Him. Notice some passages in this psalm that talk about what God did. In verse 14, "In the daytime also He led them with a cloud, and all the night with a light of fire." God led them. Notice verses 52 through 54. It says, "Made His own people to go forth like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And He led them on safely, so that they feared not, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And He brought them to the border of His sanctuary, even to this mountain, which His right hand hath purchased." God led them. God guided them. He directed them from Egypt all the way to the Promised Land. That's what God did for them. But what did they do to Him? They left Him. Notice Psalm 78 in verses 9 and 10. It says, "The children of Israel, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God, and refuse to walk in His law. God's leading them, but they're leaving God. God leads them into battle, but they turn back in the day of battle. They weren't willing to fight the battles that God led them to. You remember, God brought them to the very border of Canaan. He says, "This is your land. I'm going to give it to you." And they said, "There are giants in the land. We're as grasshoppers in their sight. We won't go in. We won't go into that land. We won't take on those giants." God led them, but they're going to leave God. They're not going to follow Him. Notice verse 41 of this psalm. Verse 41. "Yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel." They turned back. God brought them all the way to the border of the Promised Land. He led them there, but then they left Him there. Notice in verse 57, it says, "But turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow." A deceitful bow. Have you ever, we probably haven't used bows as much as we have guns, but have you ever used a gun where the sights were off? And you pointed it, and you thought it was going to hit a target, and it would shoot to the right or to the left or high or low of that target because the sights are off? That's the same idea here of a bow. You have a bow and you aim at the target, but the arrow veers off. The bow's not true. The bow can't be counted on. God's people couldn't be counted on. God led them to the Promised Land, but then they left Him there. They wouldn't follow His leadership. Notice that God delivered them, but they doubted Him. Psalm 78, beginning in verse 42, look at what God does for them. It says, "Then they remembered not His hand, nor the day when He delivered them from the enemy." And then in the next few verses we read about all the plagues that came upon Egypt. We read 6 of the 10 plagues recorded here. We don't know why we don't read all of them. He simply gave us enough to call to our attention this history. But He calls out 6 of these plagues that God brought upon Egypt. All these things that He did to deliver them. God delivered them from that Egyptian bondage. But yet, in spite of all that God did for them, they doubted Him. Notice Psalm 78, beginning in verse 19. They speak against God. They doubt whether or not He can provide them with the things that they need. Notice in verse 22, "Because they believed not in God and trusted not in His salvation." They doubted God. Verse 23, "Though He had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven." God had done this, but they still doubted Him. "Had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them of the corn of heaven. Man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full. He caused an east wind to blow into heaven, and by His power He brought in the south wind. He rained flesh also upon them as dust, and feathered fowls like as the sand of the sea. And He let it fall in the midst of their camp, round about their habitations. So did they eat, and were well filled, for He gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust, but while their meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them, and slew the fattest of them, and smote down the chosen men of Israel. For all this they sinned still, and believed not for His wondrous works." In spite of everything that He did, they didn't believe. He delivered them, but they doubted Him. How could you ever doubt one who had done what God had done for them? We've never seen a miracle, but they saw a number of miracles. They saw the Red Sea parted before their eyes. They saw a wall of water on either side. How do you ever forget that? How do you ever move further in life and forget that this is what God did? How do you ever get to a point to where you say, "I don't know if God can do this or not. I don't know if this is beyond God's power"? How do you ever get to that point when you've seen that? And that's the argument here in Psalm 78. How do you doubt a God that does that? How do you doubt a God that rains bread from heaven? How do you doubt Him? How do you doubt a God that sends water from a rock? How do you doubt that God? When you've seen that, how can you then turn around and doubt whether or not He has the power to help you? It's just amazing to think that they doubted a God who had done so much for them. Notice that God fed them, but they flattered Him. Now, we've talked about here in the context that God fed them, the opening of the windows of heaven, so we won't go back through this. But there are some interesting things that you ought to consider. In verse 24, we have raining down manna. The bread came down literally like rain comes down. It's referred to as the corn of heaven. It's described as wafers, light bread with a taste of honey. That was manna. Oh, how wonderful it must have been. It's the corn of heaven. It's angels' food, is the way it's described in verse 25. But not only did He give them bread, He gave them quail. Remember Him blowing the quail in so that they ate as much as they literally gorged themselves on the quail that God sent their way. Have you ever eaten quail? Oh, it's wonderful. If you've never had quail, you ought to have quail. It's a delicacy. I remember when I lived in Walnut, Mississippi, there was a quail farm. It wasn't too far away. And you could go and hunt quail, and then they would dress the quail and prepare the quail for you. I did never go hunt there, but they served quail as well, and I did get to enjoy it. It's wonderful. God provided His people with quail and with bread. He fed them. Notice verses 70 through 72. He fed them in another way. He fed them by giving them leaders who took care of them. He gave them David. He chose David also as servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes, great with young, He brought him to feed Jacob His people and Israel and His inheritance. So He fed them according to the integrity of his heart, and He guided them by the skillfulness of His hands. There are three things here said about David beginning in verse 70. First of all, we see his humility. He's among the sheepfolds. He's a humble shepherd. We see the humility of David. But then as you go down through here, we see the integrity of David in verse 72. Integrity of his heart. And then we see the ability of David. He guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. David was known for his humility, for his integrity, and yes, for his ability. And God gave them David to be their leader, to guide them and to help them. God fed them. But notice what they did to God. They flattered God. This is an interesting passage in the Psalm. There's some things in this Psalm that I'm convinced you don't find anywhere else in the Bible. There's language, there are words that are used that's not used this way anywhere else in the Bible. And so it's an interesting Psalm, and there's some things that you ought to mark. Notice in verse 36. Well, we'll begin in verse 34 to kind of get the context. Wherefore He slew them, then they sought Him, and they returned and inquired early after God. And they remembered that God was their rock, and the high God their Redeemer. God got their attention. But notice verse 36. Nevertheless, they did flatter Him with their mouth, and they lied unto Him with their tongues. They flattered God. You ever done that? Have you ever tried to flatter God? Maybe you've tried to flatter somebody else. Maybe you said something about somebody else that you really didn't mean. You're just trying to get on their good side. You're just trying to get them to do something for you. Maybe you're just trying to get them to like you. And so you flattered them. Insincere type of praise. They did that with God. Can you imagine that? You can get by with that with people because sometimes people are gullible. And sometimes people can't see through what you're trying to do. They don't see that you don't really mean that. But God's an all-wise, all-knowing God. You really can't flatter God. Oh, God can see through that. God can see that you're lying. God can see you don't really mean it. They flattered God. When these bad things happened, they came back to God and they said, "Oh God, we love you. God, we're so sorry we did that. God, we will never do that again." But they didn't mean a word of it. There are people every day in their prayers that say to God, "God, I'm sorry I did that. I won't do that again." And they're already planning the next time when they can do it. Flattering God. Notice the next verse, verse 37. For their heart was not right with Him, neither were they steadfast in His covenant. Their heart wasn't right. Their heart wasn't in it. Jesus said, but in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines and commandments of men. This people honoreth me with their mouths, they draw nigh unto me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Their heart isn't in it, Jesus said. They're just flattering me. They don't really mean it. How many people try to flatter God? It may work with men, but it won't work with Him. Notice as well that God empowered them, but they limited Him. God empowered them. Throughout this psalm, we read of things that God did for them, that God allowed them to do, that they couldn't have done without Him. Verse 13, He divided the sea. He caused them to pass through. He made the waters to stand as an heap. God empowered them. They didn't have any power to do that. Only God had the power to do that. But God allowed them to cross on dry ground. Notice verse 55 of Psalm 78. It says, He cast out the heathen also before them and divided them an inheritance by line and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. God empowered them. God enabled them to be able to drive these people out of the land. God gave them the power to do that. They didn't have the power to do that on their own. Verse 66, He smote His enemies in the hinder parts. He put them to a perpetual reproach. You don't remember the hemorrhoids? You don't remember that Philistine history there that the Old Testament gives us? And how God brought a reproach upon them and how that they couldn't wait to get rid of that ark. They didn't want that ark among them anymore. Here, take it. You can have your magic box back. We don't want it. We don't like it. They had captured the ark of God. They had put it in the house of their gods, as if to say, our gods are more powerful than your God. But they came in the next morning and Dagon was down on his face, his head broken off. God had overpowered him. And then God began to afflict them, and they wanted that ark out of there. They didn't want it in their midst anymore. Here's this history. God empowered His people. But notice what they did. They limited Him. Now here's another one of those verses that, as far as I know, you're probably not going to find this stated as clearly anywhere else as you find it right here. The language is amazing. We say this a lot. We talk about limiting God, but here's a passage that literally uses those words of limiting God. Yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They limited God. God is an all-powerful God. And yet sometimes we limit what He is able to do by our lack of faith. We talked about this morning in our Wednesday morning Bible class about the fact that God giveth liberally. God has a storehouse full of blessings that He wants to give. But He's waiting for us to ask, and sometimes we don't ask. And so there's all these blessings that God wants to give us, that He won't give us, that He can't give us, because we won't ask. We're limiting Him. We're limiting His ability. How many times is our faith so small that we don't ever imagine what God can do? And thereby we limit God by our lack of faith. How often do we limit God by our lack of courage? Great battles that God will fight for us. God will win for us. But we have to be courageous enough to go forth. And sometimes we're not courageous enough to do that. We limit God. What could God do in your life? What could God do in my life if we would just let Him do it? If we just had the love and the faith and the courage to do what we ought to be doing, what could God do in our lives? What could God do in this congregation if we weren't constantly putting our feet on the brakes? Afraid to let God show His power. What could He do? We'd be overwhelmed at what God could do. But we limit God. Failing to have the faith and the courage, the other attributes that we ought to have. They were doing that. In Mark chapter 5 and verses 35 and 36, we have an occasion from the ministry of Jesus where Jesus tells a man, only believe, only believe. It says, while he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which said, Thy daughter's dead. Why troublest thou the master any further? As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he saith unto the ruler of the synagogue, Be not afraid, only believe. Here was this ruler of the synagogue there on behalf of his daughter, believing that Jesus could do something. But when the news came that she was dead, don't bother the Lord anymore. Leave the Lord alone. Jesus, in hearing this discussion going on, He can heal my daughter. Well, your daughter's dead. Well, then I won't trouble Him. Jesus says, I won't believe. You remember the discussion in John chapter 11 with Martha? And Martha says, Yea, Lord, I know. I know that there will be a resurrection at the last day. Lord, I'm not a Sadducee. I believe in the resurrection. Jesus says, though He were dead, yet shall He live. Do you believe that? We limit God so often, not realizing what God is capable of doing. Ephesians chapter 3, we talked about it this morning. He's able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. I don't ask enough, and I don't think big enough. And because I don't ask, and because I don't allow my thinking to be as big as it ought to be, I limit God. Well, what God could do in my life if I would just let Him do it. What He could do in your life if we would just be clay in the hand of the potter. God forgave them, but they sinned against Him. Notice Psalm 78 and verse 38. What a beautiful verse this is. Psalm 78 and verse 38. They flattered God, remember. Their heart wasn't in it. Verse 38, But He, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity, and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned He His anger away, and did not stir up all His wrath. God forgave them. But the text says again and again that they sinned against God. God gives forgiveness, they sin. God gives more forgiveness, they sin. Notice verse 17 of Psalm 78, And they sinned yet more against Him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. God does all this for them. They sin again. They sin even more than they did before. Notice verse 32, Psalm 78. It says, For all this they sinned still, and believed not for His wondrous works. God forgave. They just keep right on sinning. And they sin even more. That was their history. But God's history was one of forgiveness. God remembered them. Notice Psalm 78 and verse 39. We're told, For He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away and cometh not again. God remembered they were just flesh. You know, as a parent, sometimes I have to remind myself they're just kids. They're just children. They haven't learned this yet. They haven't gotten this far yet. How many times does God have to remind Himself, they're just flesh. They're just wind. Oh, they're so frail. They so need my help and my protection. God remembered them, but they forgot God. Notice a couple of passages, verse 11, and forgot His works and His wonders that He had showed them. Verse 42, they remembered not His hand, nor the day when He delivered them from the enemy. They forgot Him. But He didn't forget them. God suffered them. In verse 38 of Psalm 78, it says, Yea, many a time turned He His anger away, did not stir up all of His wrath. You know, for every time that we read of the anger of God in the Old Testament, there are countless times where God turned His anger away, and we don't read of it at all. We take that for granted. We take for granted that when we read of these occasions of the Old Testament where God's angry, that how many times had God been angry and turned His wrath away before He got to that point? Before this one time He's going to do something to punish them. They provoked Him. This context tells us again and again how they provoked God. And they sinned yet more against Him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. Verse 18, and they tempted God in their heart by asking meat. Again and again we're told, verses 40 and 41, we find that they turned back and tempted God. They provoked Him. They grieved Him in the desert. God's long-suffering with them, and they just keep poking and prodding and provoking God. It's a good thing God's not like us. It's a good thing that God's patient and long-suffering and merciful, because if He was not, we wouldn't be here. Because we provoke Him again and again by our sinfulness, and yet He continues to suffer. He continues to be patient with us. Psalm 78 is a great history chapter, but it's a history of two things. It is the history of their mistakes, but it's also the history of God's mercy. And we need to teach our children both. We need to teach our children about the mercy of God and what God has done for us and how good God's been to us. But we also need to teach our children about the failures of those that have gone before. Help them to learn from those mistakes. But it's a twofold equation. The failings have always been on our side, never on His. He's always been merciful to us. The mistakes have always been made by us. Our children need to learn these lessons, lest they repeat them. Thank you for your attention tonight.